Now we are going to use the break-even analysis example to continue our discussion of sensitivity analysis and scenario analysis. So far we have looked at how we can see the impact of one or two parameters on a certain model and its decisions using one-way data table, two-way data table, and the goal-seek function in Excel. What if we are interested in how the change in more than two parameters affect the modeling decision? Then what do we do? We will discuss that next, but before we get into that, I would like to encourage you to use this particular example to work further on creating one-way and two-way data tables and the goal-seek function. For example, in this particular example, try to find the response rate that will give you a net profit of 0 using the goal-seek function. Or try and decide which of these 8 parameters we have are more certain or are more uncertain. And then pick a few and try to create some one-way and two-way data tables. What we will look at next is what happens when you have more than two parameters changing at once. If you have more than two parameters changing at once, perhaps you may be looking at situations where you have scenarios where parameters are moving in similar directions in a manner that makes business sense. For example, let's say for this example, I have 6 different scenarios. The current scenario, the optimistic scenario, the pessimistic scenario, scenario where I have a high average order, scenario where I have a high response rate, and I have a very low response rate. And let's say in each of these 6 different scenarios, I'd like to vary these 4 different parameters. The fixed cost to print changes, the average order size changes, the variable percentage cost per order changes, or the response rate changes. The current scenario parameters are picked from our base case. The optimistic scenario is where everything good is high and everything bad is low. So average order size and response rates are high and the costs are low. The pessimistic scenario is the opposite, where the cost parameters are high and the average order size and response rate is low. And high average orders, everything is the same as the current scenario, but the average order size is much higher. The same thing with response rate. Here everything is the same, the response rate is very high. And here everything is the same, but the response rate is very low. So the question is, can I find a quick way to try out each different scenario and then report the results, report what happens to maybe the revenues, the costs, and most importantly, what happens to the profit. So there are 2 ways of doing this. One is using Excel's generic scenario managing function. 2 is a way that I have come up with a colleague from University of San Francisco, Professor Tom Grossman. So I will quickly talk about the Excel's built-in functionality and why I don't like it, and then I'll show you the engine that Professor Grossman and I developed. So if you want to analyze different scenarios using Excel's built-in tools, you go to Data. Under Data ribbon, you see Data Tools. Under Data Tools, you go to What If Analysis and you choose Scenario Manager. Now in Scenario Manager, you can add different scenarios one by one, and then you get the result once you enter each scenario. The thing that I do not like about Excel's built-in Scenario Manager is that it gives you a static set of results. So I can enter these 6 different scenarios and get the effect on net profit using Excel Scenario Manager. But if, let's say, somebody came up to me and said, you know what, the variable cost of printing changed from 10 cents to 12 cents, then if I make this change, Scenario Manager will not be able to update my net profit values. So it's a static model, and when you enter new parameter values for your model, it doesn't update your scenario results, which I don't find particularly useful. Now let's look at the engine that we envisioned. The idea here is this. I look at my original model and I know that 4 of these original parameters are no longer static. They're likely to change based on which scenario is chosen. What I will do is I will find a way to enter a scenario number here in cell A2. Once I select the scenario number here, in row 22 here, I will pick up the values for that particular scenario using the scenario list table down here. Once I get the scenario related parameter values in row 22, then I'm going to use that to populate my scenario related variables. So how do I do that? First of all, let's populate this in use row. Once I select a scenario number here, let's actually do a data validation here. I'm gonna just go and say allow a list. So don't let users enter any value they want. The source is coming from here. The users will only be able to choose 1 through 6. I hit OK, so they choose 1 through 6. So once the user chooses which scenario they'd like to focus on, then that scenario value will be the used scenarios. So I go to B22 and enter A2 there. And now once I know that scenario 4 is being used, I'm going to populate the scenario name and the values that needs to be used for all these 4 parameters using either a match index function or a lookup function. So in this particular case, I'm going to use the index function, which is very straightforward. I'll say index, look at this array, and in this array, pick up the 4th value. Now, I want to be able to copy this formula to cells D22, E22, F22, and G22. In order to do that, I need to use some absolute referencing. So here, I'm going to make sure that when I copy paste this, the column keeps changing, but the row reference should remain the same. But since I copy paste the whole thing within the same row, I don't need to worry about that. But if I go to the pink reference, it needs to be absolute. So I push F4 here, and let's show you the formula again. And then I go ahead and copy this, and then paste special formulas. So now, as you can see, if I choose, let's say, scenario 1, I get current, the value of the current parameters. If I go to 3, I get pessimistic, I get the pessimistic parameters. The next thing I need to do is, now that I know which scenario is in use and what values need to be used for that scenario, I need to go to cell C7, C13, C14, and C16 and connect them, link them to row 22. So I'm going to say equals D22, average order size equals E22, variable percentage cost per order equals F22, and response rate equals G22. By the way, notice one additional spreadsheet engineering I have taken. Normally I use the blue color for all parameters, but here I'm now using 2 different colors for parameters. The parameters that are static are still in blue, and the parameters that are coming from scenarios are now a light green. So now if I change scenario 1, I get my base case scenario with a net profit of 17,400. If I choose the optimistic scenario, my profit goes up to 56,000. If I choose the pessimistic scenario, my profit actually is negative, so I'm losing money. Now, can I use this particular setup to see what happens to different model outputs for different scenarios using a data table? The answer is yes. Here's how I do this. I first create a one-way data table. I have done this before. In the one-way data table, I would like to change the scenario numbers one after the other. And for each new scenario number, I'd like the scenario name to be reported, the average order size to be reported, and the net profit to be reported. So I have a one-way table. The columns tell me what to change, and the rows tell me what I want to be observed. In order to run this particular one-way data table, I highlight everything. I go to the data ribbon. Under the data ribbon, I go to BreakEven Analysis. And I choose data table. It says, well, are your inputs at the row or the column? Well, I have my inputs as in the column, and the row I have my outputs. So I'm going to go to column input cells, and Excel needs to know each time it picks a value from this column where to put it. And I know that these scenario numbers need to go to A2. So it's gonna choose a number 1 through 6 that's gonna go to A2, and then each time you see different values in A2, you're gonna get different net profit, etc. So I go ahead and hit OK, and this is pre-formatted for us. So what I get is, well, what happens to my profit under different scenarios. Again, this is a fairly versatile and dynamic way of looking at this. And again, remember at the beginning I had told you Excel's built-in scenario manager is not very dynamic. Here, if I say, oh well, variable cost of printing has changed from 10 cents to 12 cents, I simply change this value to 12 cents, and you will see that your data table is automatically updated. So you can track the changes in your scenarios automatically when you change different parameters. I also want to quickly show you a redesign of the scenario engine. The two main differences between the previous engine we looked at and this one is I have divided the inputs into two groups, but not based on whether they were printing related inputs and response related inputs, but I actually put one set of inputs, the fixed ones in one place and the scenario related inputs in another place. So again, this is another way of creating a spreadsheet that's more readable. In addition to that change, I also have a small break-even model that tells me what the break-even response rate would be under any given scenario. So I encourage you to look at this model carefully and ask me questions if you have any.